And the Lipatti CDs arrived, and I put on his performance of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Every single person in the shop came up to see what was playing. Even if listeners who are less able to articulate what they're hearing or maybe aren't as trained, I do think when you hear that quality, I think a lot of people will catch it.
And welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and we have on the line today two incredible guests. First of all, our master of music, Elias Axel Pedersen. Welcome to the show again, Elias. I'm grateful to have you on.
I love co-hosting this stuff with you.
It is a ball. Yeah. It's so much fun, and we get the best guests mostly because of you. So thank you. And then we also have on the line Mark Ainley. We've had him on before. And I'm excited so much about this subject. Mark is a specialist in several fields. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about is he's been active in curating and researching historical piano recordings and has gained an international reputation as an expert in this arena. He has written about several legendary pianists for International Piano Magazine, Classical Recordings Quarterly, and International Classical Recordings Collector, as well as CD liners on various international labels. He's probably most known and maybe his claim to fame is discovering some unique recordings of Lipatti and his amazing piano work. And so just again, I want to welcome you to the show, Mark. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I'm looking forward to tonight's.
Yeah, as did we. Is fantastic. Well, and I'm excited about this particular conversation as we kind of went back and forth about what to talk about. I think you came up with a tremendous idea, and it reminded me. So what we want to talk about is how to recognize and how to what to listen for. What makes a good performance. Specifically piano performance. And I told the guys earlier that it reminded me of when I was watching the Olympics as a younger man, and I watched these two sets of skaters. I think it was the ice dance competition actually, and they were performing, and it was both beautiful, but there was one that was just spectacular in my mind. Like they were flamboyant and they were big and all their movements were incredible, and they went prone onto the ice at the end, and it was just amazing performance in my mind. And then the other one was, I mean, it was good, it was spectacular, it was great, but it was not what I thought was the best of the night. And then one of the commentators on the show literally did a side by side and pointed out so much of the detail that went into that other performance that I thought was second tier. And I noticed just what amazing detail and incredible skill and how tight they were. It was an amazing adjustment. And I literally saw these performances with brand new eyes. And I hope to bring new ears to maybe some of our listeners as we talk about what makes a great piano performance. So I'm excited to talk about this, Mark.
Yeah, I think it's really important because, we're not trained how to listen and what to listen for. So even if you learn how to play the piano, and I think a lot of people, at least in my generation, people took piano lessons, even if they didn't go to sort of, training for a moderately even professional level. But I don't think we ever really learned how to listen. And I think a lot of music appreciators and people who go to concerts, they're hearing the music, but they're not necessarily hearing some of those finer details, as you're saying. They might hear some of the big elements, right? For example, like in an orchestra, are the musicians actually playing together? And if any soloist, are they? You might be able to recognize if you have some musical ears that, that was a wrong note, or well, that part was really loud, and or the hands weren't together. You might be able to hear some basic things like that, but when it comes to some of those finer details and what separates, if we want to say the A list from the B list or the C list,
Right.
I think, unfortunately, we're not really trained in that. And of course, I think it's great if people are just going to concerts and buying recordings and they're appreciating the music. That's already great, because we want to make sure that classical music does well and it survives. And I think this is important. But we also do want to be able to appreciate more than just the composer on a basic level. We want to hear an interpreter who's really bringing the music to life. There's a great anecdote of the great Beethoven pianist Arthur Schnabel applauding after somebody's performance at a concert, which apparently wasn't very good, because his friend who was sitting next to him said, "How come you're applauding such a terrible performance?" And he said, "I'm applauding Beethoven." Which I think we're all doing when we go to a concert anyway,
Yes.
right? There's that performance, that relationship with the piece of music. But a skilled interpreter will be able to bring something particular out in that piece of music that somebody else might not, that can help us appreciate it more. And I think the more we're able to listen to these nuances, the more we can appreciate both the performer and the piece of music as well.
Yeah, I was going to say a quick little thing here too. When you mentioned Beethoven, I think that's one reason why he and many of the other the other big names are performed so often, because people recognize the music, and that's another discussion of, how do you get newer composers, or even composers that are famous but not quite as famous, the sort of second tier, not necessarily in talent but just in fame. How do you get those into the concert hall? Because Beethoven's Ninth and Fifth are going to be played every season,
Always.
So,
and the same, there's like a pool of like 5 out of Mozart's 27 concertos that get played,
Right.
and always the same. And when you hear Schumann, it's going to be Kinderszenen, Chrysler, it's opus 15,
12,
16, 17, and what about anything over opus 100, when there are some later works by famous composers as well that aren't well known. Mettner is well known now and better known, but 50 years ago, during Mettner's lifetime as well, 70 years ago or so, he wasn't as well known. And it's a shame, and it's true. There's all kinds of great music, Lyapunov, or all kinds of and Blumenfeld, some great composers who I think people would like that. But this comes down to then part of the challenge, that on some level people want some familiarity, because they don't want to be completely in the dark, and they want to have a feeling that they kind of know something that's going on. And this is where Rachmaninoff suffered from this, of having to play his prelude in C sharp minor in every recital because it was a big hit and everybody wanted to hear it, and then everybody wanted to hear, Paderewski play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata or something like that. It's people want to hear what they already know, but the reality is that a lot of the discovery comes when we hear something we don't know. And I think the same goes for when we hear an interpretation that brings out something new in something that we already, in something we already know. Like I did a podcast episode recently where I compared 14 different versions of the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. And I mean, they're all different and they're all great, and timing varying between 4 minutes and 7.5 minutes for that one movement.
It's a big
difference. And people can just dismiss it based on the tempo, for example, based on the speed. It's like, oh well, it's so slow. It's like, but if you listen to the whole thing, you'll hear why he's doing that and what he's doing with that. And so it's not to just choose this one axis, if you want, of like speed, and that's like a horizontal plane, but there's more dimensions and more multidimensional planes, if we want to get mathematical with this, in terms of what a performer is doing, that they can bring out. And so, I think for novice listeners, it's great if they're paying attention to whatever they're paying attention to. Oh, he got softer here, or oh, that was faster. That's fine, and if they have some emotional reaction to it, that's great. But I think it's helpful to know a little bit more what it is that we can listen for and start to adjust our ears, just like Mike, what you were saying in terms of how you started seeing that ice dance competition differently once somebody pointed out some of those finer nuances.
Right.
So I was
And
going to actually ask, and this is, well, two things. One was when you brought up people, the average listener, might hear different dynamics or maybe notes that are not together. And of course, I would contend that most listeners probably don't hear those things, because how many concerts have I played where I just think, oh man, I missed a few of those notes, and I clip that, and I afterwards, people are like, oh, it was amazing, and I said, well, didn't you hear, like in the middle, I had a small slip? Oh, well, I didn't notice it. So that's one issue. I think most non-musicians, and not even musicians, like I would say non-pianists, might
Yes,
not notice those things. And then
true.
the idea that more knowledge or more insight into some of these things that we're going to discuss, I wonder if it gives us more enjoyment or less. And what I mean is, I'll go to a performance and of maybe a famous pianist, and I'm thinking of one in my mind right now, of a piece I've performed, and it's with a big orchestra, and so I have all these expectations, and maybe it doesn't live up to those, and so
Yeah.
I don't really, get a lot out of it. I still get a lot musically and understand and kind of make my judgments, but I'm sure there are some people in the audience that just love the experience, So
That's it, and I think that's great, and I think it's still important. I was interviewed a little while ago by Leela Getz of the Vancouver Recital Society, and I can't remember if it was during our interview or afterwards, where she mentioned, that a critic had once commented, given a negative review, and one of her subscribers wrote, "But I enjoyed the concert. Wasn't I supposed to?"
yeah,
I think it's important. This can be challenging, and it is
yeah,
challenging for me because there are. I do get disappointed a lot, uh, and I also get pleasantly surprised a lot,
yeah,
because there are, and this is one of the challenges nowadays. And I'll say that it's. I don't name names when I'm talking about musicians whose artistry I don't particularly appreciate as much as others. But I've noted, I think in any industry, acting, is a good example. The box office big sellers aren't always the best, and there are always musicians who, like actors, everybody's been saying for ages, how come this person isn't getting more roles? They are so good. How come they're not getting booked more? And there's all kinds of actors who finally got their break, after a certain period. And a lot of musicians, it's the same thing. And they're getting C-list or B-list or maybe even less bookings.
Yeah.
And other people are, filling up huge concert halls, and the standard of playing actually really isn't objectively, and really when you pay attention, it's just not the same. Georges Boulette is a great example. He was 59 when he had his breakthrough Carnegie Hall recital in 1974, and he'd been on the concert circuit since he was in his late
10 or
teens.
12, yeah.
At least. And he played for a Hollywood movie in 1960 and 1970 when he played at this International Piano Library benefit concert. That's when he just blew the roof off of the place. But it was still 4 years later, and then RCA recorded that concert. Then boom, he was launched into superstardom. And it's like, where's this guy been? It's like he's been here the whole time, and for various reasons, he just wasn't getting the attention. And I think that that's always the case.
Yeah. So, we don't live in a meritocracy, and we never will. So
no. And so this is why I also think it's important not to just go by name, where I will go hear musicians I haven't heard before. And I think it's important because you never know who you're going to hear and what you're going to hear, and not to judge and not to prejudge, and to also sometimes just go for the experience. And okay, I didn't like the performance as much, and I get to applaud Beethoven.
Okay. Yeah.
And by the way, I think there's something to be said for even being at a performance, having the ability to distinguish a good performance from a bad one is not an unpleasant experience. It's an experience that maybe obviously you prefer to see the greats, but at some point having the ability to identify what makes a good performance and what could have been better, that's part of the experience of seeing a live performance in any genre.
Mhm.
I agree. I do agree. So, but it's like everything, right? I think everything in life is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And this is something that can happen, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we are going to enjoy, we will be disappointed sometimes, and we'll be pleasantly surprised, and we'll be absolutely elated at other times. So
Yeah.
it's kind of the territory. It's never all the same.
Well, let's get into this a little bit and
Mhm.
talk about the piano, and let's talk about the artist who plays pianos, and some of the things that maybe a good artist is thinking about as they play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe we can
Well,
do an outline
I think
first.
it's
Yeah. Or
sure.
yeah.
So there's a number of different things, like qualities of playing, or aspects of piano playing, that I think we can pay attention to, and it's useful, I think, to describe a little bit, and then hopefully we'll be able to listen to some examples, and people can, the great advantage of a podcast like this is they can go back and listen again and hear those recordings again. But I'll just say to start off that I would like to keep the analogy of comparing it to an actor, uh, because I think that it's a useful comparison at times. So if you think about, you don't think that an actor has great technique because they said all of the words without making a mistake. So I think that this whole thing, oh, he has great technique, and he played really fast, and
Right.
hit all the right notes. I mean, it's preposterous that we think that only is technique. And I tend to, when people use that as the general, this all-encompassing word for technique, I tend to break that down and say, okay, no, we're talking about digital precision,
Mhm.
right? When you're
Right.
talking about that manual dexterity, or actual, like,
Yeah.
digital precision,
Yeah.
in terms of, like, the typewriter quality element to it, and like an artist's, the actor was able to pronounce all of the words. Well, good for him. You would expect that, and I think that never really goes into question. But there's various elements with which they do this, and I can use a couple of more popular examples with this. If we think about tone, first of all, there's the voice and the resonance. Each actor will have their own timbre to their voice, and it's recognizable. And you recognize Maggie Smith and Alan Rickman, as Snape. I think a lot of these great actors were in Harry Potter movies, and there are
They were.
there's
Yeah.
there's the tone of voice. Then there's the articulation, and Severus Snape in those Harry Potter movies was perfect because articulation. He was so exaggerated it, but it brought out something in the character.
Right.
And musicians as well, when they're articulating the phrase, the way they clarify some notes and accent some notes, or make some of them, they highlight a certain note by striking the key differently. That's the same thing. So if you imagine in general that a musical phrase, a melody that you might sing and that a pianist plays, and that might be that one phrase is like a sentence, how they shape that in the same way that an actor wouldn't just read the words, to be or not to be, that is the question.
Yeah.
That doesn't reveal anything, but it's like,
No,
how is
no
he actually
inflection.
shaping it with the tone of voice? Exactly. So this inflection, so the articulation is one thing that adds to the inflection. Then the dynamics, are they getting louder? Are they getting softer? How are they phrasing? That's part of the articulation. Is it fluid, or is it, do they break things up, or part of the sentence is fluid? Do they pause between words in a certain way, so they're timing? There's all kinds of other effects that pianists are able to do. I think that, and I think this is where the pedal comes in, tone production. I believe that people tend to think that the piano just has the piano sound, and that's all there is.
Yeah.
But when you hear the really great pianists, there are so many different kinds of sounds that they produce, and at different levels of softness or loudness, which we'll refer to as dynamics, that the really good ones, it sounds like an orchestra. And in fact, Edwin Fischer, I interviewed a pupil of Edwin Fischer's. He was a great Bach pianist who made the first ever recording of the Well-Tempered Clavier in the 1930s. And he would tell his students, he's like, oh, your cellos are a little too soft.
That's brilliant.
to bring out and to imagine that certain sound. If this were violins, or if this was flute, or if this was clarinet, the oboe and the clarinet and the flute would all be in the same registers, but you can intone, get a different sound out of the instrument. So that is one of the big things that I think is really important. And the voicing in terms of which melody is louder, which notes are louder, what's the balance between notes. If you imagine 2, 3, or 4 people singing, and you can think of any of your favorite pop bands as well. If you think about the balance between the different voices, and who do you hear first loudest and who do you hear second loudest, and you don't want to hear one but you don't hear the others, you want to hear this balance of them. And that's something as well that really great pianists are able to do. They're able to bring in this balance between all of these different notes that are all there, and make it sound actually like in an orchestra. You wouldn't confuse the cello with the oboe, because you can hear they have a different sonority, and that's really what a pianist has to do.
And it is so difficult on a piano because it is so subtle, because it is essentially the same instrument.
Mm-hmm.
But to do that with your fingers and to do that with your body,
Yes.
as Elias knows, is quite a feat to do that properly.
Well, yeah, and I was also going to say, you mentioned that the piano sound is sort of ubiquitous, or not monotone, maybe homogeneous sound.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's become more like that in,
Yeah.
let's say, the last 50 or 60 years. If we look 100 years ago at just how many types of pianos there were, and
Absolutely.
most of the, the, I guess, what am I trying to say? The things that have been invented, I guess, the technique of the piano, of the actual instrument. There hasn't been much
Mm-hmm.
invented in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
structure in 150 years since Liszt, really, but there have been minor changes. But even in his time, there's just such a great variety of tone across the registers in a single piano that we don't
Yes.
have today, because it's so many, or so far fewer companies and whatnot. So I think
Totally.
that makes a
This is
big difference.
It absolutely does. And, my specialty being historical recordings that were, I'm primarily focused on ones that were made before 1950. A lot of those instruments come from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and they were voiced differently. They were constructed differently. You're hearing, if you're listening just to Alfred Cortot, you're going to be hearing Pleyels, Blütners, and Steinways. Because he recorded on all 3 of those. And you hear certain musicians. And yet, if we take an example, EMI's Abbey Road Studios, from the 1930s onward, they had this incredible Steinway, which I'd love to track down, number 299. Apparently, that's what's written on all the recording ledgers. Cortot recorded on it, Geza Anda, Dinu Lipatti, Beno Mosejevich, Edwin Fischer, Artur Schnabel. They all recorded on that piano. And
it's hard to say how good it is, though, anymore, but still, I'm sure it has
yeah,
incredible qualities.
It was incredible, but you can still hear the difference in tone between those different pianists.
Yeah,
you can recognize Cortot and Lipatti within 3 notes. They were so distinctive in their sonority, in their approach, and so on. So even though they were playing the very same instrument in the very same studio with the same engineers.
Yeah, I was going to say that makes a difference too. What kind of sound are you going for? And the engineers have a certain idea they might want. Maybe a warmer sound, or I know in Europe that, at least nowadays, maybe it's becoming more again similar. But European recordings tended to be, I think I'm getting this right, further back and just more of the room. And the U.S. recordings tended to be more in the piano, a little bit larger, maybe a little brighter. But maybe with them it was the same engineer, and still you can hear differences because of their interpretations.
And I think that, unfortunately, we've heard since the tape era and, heavily spliced recordings and miking and, sticking the microphone inside the piano. I have no idea, everybody's
how natural is that?
It is just completely ridiculous. I have no idea why that became a thing, but I think it's created a very unnatural sound on the recording that people then don't get in concert, and then they are disappointed when they go to a concert that they can't hear it the way they hear it at home. And so that starts to become an issue as well. So all of this being, a roundabout way of, leading into the sound of the instrument, but the sound that the individual brings to the instrument, I think is something that is unique. And that's one of the amazing things of, when we think about, some of the ones that I named there who recorded at Abbey Road, but if we just take Lipatti and Courteau, with both of them, a number of these qualities, tone, articulation, the pedaling, the timing, all of it is completely individual. And you can tell usually within 5 seconds if it's one of those two artists. I would say Marcel Meyer as well, who played a very light action Steinway that actually sounds more like a French piano, like a Pleyel or an Erard. She's another artist whose sonority was so distinctive, as well as other qualities of her playing, that usually within 5 seconds, you can tell that she's the one who's at the keyboard.
Well, and I think Mark, and maybe maybe speak to this just for a second. The piano is such a large instrument. Sometimes you can almost equate it to a large speaker. And so when an artist, somebody who knows what they're doing, plays that, in my mind, what it does is it just intensifies and
amplifies.
Just the sound of in other words, it intensifies and dramatically increases the differences because of, like, if I'm speaking through a small speaker, the difference between my voice and your voice may not be that, because you don't have the full EQ quality and things like that. But if I have a large speaker and I have very nice equipment, which modern pianos really are, if you can play that tone pounces off the piano if you're doing it right.
Well, it pounces off the piano if you're doing it wrong as well. But
I guess that's
a lot of people won't notice the difference.
Yeah, it exaggerates whatever you're doing. It's funny because we think of like dynamics. I always get in this discussion with people. It's sort of dynamics are partly physics. They're absolute dynamics, but our brain doesn't really compute that. So we're listening more to differentiations between dynamics, and it's a subjective measure. And so I always tell people, you can actually play softer on a larger piano, and they're like, well, can't you just get a really small upright? Isn't that going to be softer? I mean, maybe if you have a computer that does that, but the control that you have with a longer key,
the difference between the loud and the soft,
difference between the loud and the soft, you're going to process that, and you're going to have more control over that soft as well. So you actually have more dynamic range in the low end, the piano and pianissimo, on a large 9-foot grand than you do on an upright. So,
yeah, absolutely.
There's one other thing, if you don't mind, before we go to the next. But you mentioned the concept of miking a piano, which I think a lot of engineers are realizing, the good ones at least, that you can't just put a mic under the soundboard. Luckily, I worked with one who's phenomenal, and he's very good at finding those balances. And it is one thing when you listen to a recording and you hear that soloist, for example, with the concerti, and it's always very clear. And then you go to a concert hall, which maybe doesn't have the best acoustics, maybe not the best piano, maybe not the greatest pianist, and you often don't hear the solo parts. And it's like, wow, what's going on? I always wish orchestras played a little softer in those sections with the soloist, but it's just such a different experience from the live, from the recording. And it's probably like pop bands too, and they are similar in this regard, but then a little different too. Pop bands, you hear a great recording which has been EQ'd by an engineer or 10 engineers, and it's just everything's perfect, it's auto-tuned, everything's synced up. Then you go hear them live, and they can't really sing, they can't really dance, they can't really play. It's often quite disappointing.
I mean, it also, the overall experience, and this is where I do think recording engineering has messed things up in terms of this aim for clinical perfection. I was lucky enough to go to a Montreal Symphony Orchestra recording in, I believe it was the late 80s, when they recorded La Mer and the Nocturnes of Debussy. And I could not believe, I was in the recording booth. I was trying to keep very still. And the lead engineer, followed in the score and called out the instruments that were about to come in, and his assistant boosted the mic levels
Preach.
for every group of instruments, because each section was separately mic'd. And I'm thinking, what's the conductor's job?
Yeah, to make those
Right?
balances.
To make those balances. So basically the conductor's doing his balance and they're doing what they're imposing their balance in terms of what should be brought forward. But what you're hearing is this layering of these different levels as opposed to this blend that you would actually hear in the concert hall. So again, people are being trained to hear things at home that they would not hear at the concert hall. And then they go to the concert hall and it's like, well, it just sounds like a bit of a mess. And it's like, well, actually that mess is kind of a little bit closer, probably. It's not a mess, it's a blend. And, like Starbucks, and this is the flavor actually that the composer wanted. He wanted that blend. He didn't want everything, the one flute to stand out above the whole orchestra, because it's not possible. It's supposed to be at a different level, sort of blended in. And the same thing has happened with the piano, where it's there's been an exaggerated sound. The instruments have become more streamlined and brighter and clangier, as I'm sure you've observed yourself. And it's not at all the same sound as even 50 years ago, let alone 70 or 100, where it was very, very different. And you did hear a large variety of instruments. It wasn't just Steinway, and the Steinways then were different. Of course, in New York Steinways and Hamburg Steinways, you could hear the difference. Then there was Pleyels and Erards and Baldwins and Blütners.
Well, that's a whole other part of artistry, is the building of the piano.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a whole other.
But a great artist will be able to, on whatever instrument. Lipatti's last recital was recorded on a Gaveau. I don't think it was a great instrument or particularly well recorded, but you can still hear the genius on that less ideal instrument. And there's a lot of recordings of great pianists in private circumstances and so on, playing on instruments that were less than ideal, and they still do amazing things.
All right. Well, I would love to maybe talk about and hear some examples of this tone that you're talking about, that the people should be listening for when you're, as we've been describing it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So let's talk this out a little bit. Elias, what do you think? I was wondering, we could listen to Corto's sound, Hoffman, Marilla Jonas. What do you feel like listening to?
I think Corto's so different from Hoffman is like the pianists of pianists at that time, but it's almost more modern in a way. Jonas, I'll be honest, I don't know as well. I've heard of him, but Cortot I know quite well, and I think he's a wonderful artist. And
I think if we could do something where maybe we compare maybe Hoffman to somebody else, I think that might be so people can hear like the difference of what you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Let me pull up a Cortot recording, and I think what I would like to find is. Here's one of him actually playing Bach, which is a bit unusual for him, but it's where you really get his rich singing sound. And I'd like you to imagine, when I hear Cortot, I hear there's a mahogany richness to it. And there's almost like he brings up there's this oaky whiskey kind of flavor with cigar smoke swirling around. There's this real, a throaty richness.
You're priming us. That's good.
Yeah. So if you think about, though, that, a certain actor who has, perhaps more resonance in the voice, I'm just exaggerated a little bit there. That's the kind of quality that I hear in Cortot's rich singing sound. So let's listen to him playing a bit of an arrangement of the slow movement of Bach's F minor concerto. Isn't that amazing? Mm-hmm. Elias, as a pianist, since you're a pianist, I'm really curious what your impression is just listening to that.
Yeah, it's awesome, and I'm trying. Actually, Mike, you just said some amazing things, and I think uh, some of your experiences too performing, you probably recognize that left hand. The bass is still rich for me, but
Mm.
it's still um, the piano sounds almost hollow. I mean, I always envision him as like a ghost-like figure. So I think anytime I hear his recordings, I think it's this ethereal being.
Mm-hmm.
But he does such weird things. I mean, wonderful things also with the timing and the placement of
Yeah,
notes and how he
yeah,
brings out this melodic line, often breaking rules that I even tell my students. After a long note, you listen through the long note, and
yes,
the next note can't be an accent. Well, he breaks that occasionally,
yeah.
but very very small places where it kind of goes up again
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of floats. Almost does this what Stephen Huff likes to call the Russian crescendo, da 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 da, and then kind of hovers around that. Um, instead of what we always teach, da 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 dum, it's da 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 da, and then comes back
Yeah,
around. But it's really free,
yeah.
very free playing. So
But I mean, there is so much to unpack there because Cortot had this whole thing with timing where you just can never, if you try to sing along with him, you'll start to notice, whoa, what did he just do with the timing there? Because
yep,
he's sort of, I thought he was going to go right and he went left.
yep.
Uh, but the sonority, since that's kind of what we were like, do you get what I mean by that oaky mahogany kind of like reverberant, throaty kind of richness? It's hard to describe it. There's something so penetrating
Yeah,
about his sound, but there's never any
it's not
harshness. Like
harsh.
there's
Yeah,
no edge to it.
right, right.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly it. And so that's one of the he's somebody who I remember giving an introduction in a presentation on an introduction to historical recordings to people who had zero training in music, and I played a whole bunch of great pianists. I had Lipatti and Mayer and so on, and the first note of Cortot, you could see everybody's eyes opened up,
Mhm.
and I was like, "Wow, okay, there's something here. Like they got it."
Well,
Yeah.
and there's so much there that I know we'll talk about. I mean, because we're kind of dissecting some of these pieces, but
Mm-hmm.
like the voicing just makes that whole piece work so well.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, the timing, and that's just it is it's an artist. Lisa, I think I talked to you about this one time about the idea of what makes one person doing something cheesy and the other
Mm.
person doing it art.
Yeah.
And it really is
Yeah,
has to do with intention. It has to do with like communication, and being able to make it work in the scope of that piece. And
Yeah.
that's pretty brilliant
I think
stuff.
being organic about
yeah.
it and being internally consistent. So there are things that Horowitz does and things that Cortot does here that I don't think would be really
Mm-hmm.
allowed today. Although I think there are some factions
Yeah,
in the piano world that are opening up a lot to innovation and freedom.
I agree
Um,
completely.
but
Yeah.
and I think one of my teachers, his kind of legacy is doing part of that, and we can talk about. But I think with Cortot or Horowitz, some of
Mm-hmm.
the things they do, if anybody did it today, I would just say it's imitation, it's cheesy, it's corny, and it doesn't work. But when they
Yes.
do it, somehow it's okay. Horowitz can do the D sharp minor etude and take all sorts of rhythmic liberties, and I don't care.
Yes.
you know.
Yeah, I know. Well, part of it's the ownership, though, right? So it's not
Yes.
just what they're doing, and this is also a little bit of it's so hard for us to focus on one thing because I think
Yeah.
we're so excited about all of this.
Yeah.
Is that I articulated all of those different qualities, and the fact is they're doing all of them, and that's what
Yeah.
makes it special.
Yeah.
So when Horowitz does those timing things in that Scriabin etude, It's not just the timing, though.
Yeah,
And
it's
we
mashed
hear the
up with the
timing and we say,
pedal and the
oh, he just did
tone
the
and the
timing.
voicing. Yeah.
And that's exactly it. And
Yeah.
that was something that Stephen Huff really articulates very well. And that when, young pianists now, they try to imitate Corto's rubato or Friedman's rubato or something. They're listening on that one axis of that speed, but they're not adjusting the tone or the pedaling or the dynamics and all of that. They were doing where they were creating a multi-dimensional effect by working with different elements at the same time. So as they were slowing down, they're getting softer, or as they're speeding up, maybe they're getting louder. That's just two very simple examples.
Right.
But adjusting the actual tone and the pedaling and the phrasing, maybe the articulation. So they do all of those different things at the same time. So it's not just a very simple faster, slower, even though that might be just what we really notice in the moment.
Yeah, and it's good for students to try to imitate maybe one of those aspects or axes, but you have to make it with the other things. Otherwise, it sort of just sounds forced or concocted, not organic, and it just much more experimentation is needed.
I think, Mark, you used the perfect word. It's about ownership. Like, are you owning your art? Are you taking ownership in the sound that you're providing to the audience? And I think that's something that any artist needs to just be acutely aware of. Is the sound that you're producing is really impacting how the audience feels. And if you don't have that kind of a subtlety, if you will, it's going to come across as not authentic.
That's it. And that's where, the imitating, and just copying or just saying, oh, well, he does this, or he hits his bass notes like this, and I'm going to try that. I mean, certainly in the 1950s, there was this whole ream of piano students trying to imitate Horowitz. It was a very big thing. And I think that, it's unfortunate because I think people have held him up as an example of romantic pianism when he was an example of very individual playing, but he wasn't the most, I think, the
quintessential sort of,
the quintessential, exactly, romantic pianist. I think Georges Ballet in many ways was more, and Shura Cherkassky, and perhaps a few other ones. Shall we listen to I was thinking maybe we could listen to Marcel Mayer just to get a bit of a contrast in terms of sonority.
Fantastic.
And I thought we'd listen to her play a little bit of Rameau. And again, there's so much that we can unpack just with, I was thinking of using her as an example for phrasing and for pedaling and for ornamentation, articulation. But let's just listen to her tone as well. And I think, again, I think even a novice listening to these two pianists side by side would really notice, hey, there's something a little bit different in the sound, just like you would in hearing an actor's voice. So let's listen to her play a little bit of Rameau.
Cool piece. I don't know that piece, actually.
It's so beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
but I mean, what's amazing is, you think that's Rameau, but it doesn't sound like that's music that's 300 years old, because she plays it with such vibrancy and freshness and vitality and rhythmic aliveness.
Yeah.
And that's partly, her phrasing and the fact that, she does trills that don't break the line, that actually
They're more melodic,
fluid. They're part of the melodic line. So that's that story. And then there's that tone of hers that is, I'm curious how both of you would describe that.
Well, there's a lot of energy to that tone in my mind. Like it's from what I hear, it's more eager. It's more, it has more, it doesn't have that mahogany sound that you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's more brassy in a way. And, and also, and I think that goes a lot to, as you mentioned, her, rhythm like that. Obviously the pieces are very different, but you can hear a definite artist pulse in both of those pieces. And you can hear how the pulse of the artist, and I don't even know how to describe that right, but it's a certain rhythmic energy that I think every unique individual has. And you can kind of hear that in a unique way that both of these people, provide.
Yeah, that's that ownership and that character and the individuality where they weren't holding themselves back. And that's, I think, something that's, that I think that we discussed last time, right? In terms of like the individuality in performance, and not just trying to produce this anonymous performance, but actually bringing your heart and soul into the playing. And Cortot and Mayer did that in very different ways with a very different sound as well.
Mm-hmm. It'd be curious to hear them play, obviously, the same piece and in the same setting, and see how they would approach it. I definitely, well, before I talk about what I felt, and I think Mike basically said some great things, I do want to address maybe assuage some of the fears that listeners might have that, look, the three of us are, experts in our field. We're musicians and we've listened to this stuff. But by the same token, a lot of it is subjective. So maybe we'll say something that I liked X, Y, Z, and somebody listening would be like, "Gosh, I really liked W, R, and T a lot better." And well, is my opinion, not as valid? Not necessarily, but there are some objective things that we're trying to listen for and point out. But also by the same token, those things change. So maybe somebody teaching a student in the 1920s might have said, you need to be listening more for this kind of whatever. And nowadays we're teaching slightly differently, and we're having different expectations. So just to kind of put that out there as a disclaimer.
Excellent.
Yes.
But then also to say about her playing that it just had so much energy, so much movement. And what I liked is that the voices, it's a type of piece, but both voices were very clear and distinct. But I didn't feel that one was, I heard them simultaneously clear, and it wasn't like one was overpowering or one was accompanying the other.
It was balanced.
It was very well balanced, and things were brought out when they needed to be, when they were moving. So the line just kept going, and I didn't feel a sense of, okay, well, I kind of lost what's going on there. She just keeps your interest, draws your ear back into the piece.
How would you describe her tone?
A little bit more hollow, to be honest, and maybe it's just coming over the mic. It's not as voluminous, like overarching rich. I think partly it's the type of piece. The range is a little bit smaller. It's not harsh though, which I like. It still has a lot of energy without being harsh. So
I would describe her sound as it's almost glass-like. And so there's a kind of, you said grassy, I say glassy.
I say brassy, but that's okay.
Okay, well, that too.
I like
but, there is this almost crystalline quality to her sonority that I think is again, and it works, and it can work. And she does sound different, when she's playing Ravel, that, the crystalline sound that she brings out, I think works more successfully than I think a lot of the different, the ways that a lot of people play Ravel, and she worked with him personally as well. But yeah, I find that her sound, there's this transparency to it. So the glass is sort of like, there's the shine to it, but there's also the transparency where you hear all the layers. But there's also this smoothness and the way that glass would be polished. Each note is smooth, and also each phrase is smooth, and that's just something that I love. That there's this contour as well, always with how she shapes and how she voices. That it's just sounds very, very natural.
And I think we talked about this, but I want to just re-emphasize the fact that that a lot of people could say, well, that's a different piano, different recording, different music. There's a lot of things that go into it. But I want to say we're talking about, like definite qualities of almost personality. And probably a good example is I've told Elias this story where I was playing in my church one time, and one of my students was visiting, and they didn't know I was playing. They couldn't see me, and I was just playing like some prelude music before it started. And they said, "Oh, that's Mr. Mike playing." They just knew right offhand that it was me. And I think that's they've never heard that piano. They've never been in that building. Yeah. And that's what we're talking about. It's the voice of the artist that's coming through the sound, right? Yeah.
That's it. And that's sort of what I was naming, that, you can recognize Cortot in 5 notes and Mayer in 5 notes. And I thought we'd listen to maybe some Dinu Lipatti now, and you can recognize him as well in 5 notes. And again, yes, there's the different pieces that they're playing in the different pianos. I did a video for the Ross McKee Foundation where I had 3 different pianists playing the opening of Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2, and I've actually done a podcast where I have 5 pianists playing that piece, and so those 5 pianists playing the same piece of music, and you absolutely can hear the difference, not just in speed, but also in tone and in approach and dynamics and the timing of things, and the way that, again, one actor will intone to be or not to be, or to be or not to be, or they'll accent it in a different way, even though it's the same words on the page and it's the same notes on the page for the musician. But there'll be that slight difference.
Yeah. So which piece by Lipatti are you going to choose?
I was thinking maybe since we're kind of seem to be in the Baroque era, but I thought maybe just to keep Bach. That level consistent, let's do a little bit of Bach. And I thought we'd play one of the minuets from the first partita, one of his famous final recordings before he died. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack with his playing. You're going to hear it's a lot crisper, the way he's doing things, but you're also going to hear a different kind of sound as well, I think. So let's just listen to a minute of Lipatti.
I don't think people realize just how crazy that was. I listened to him when I performed this piece like 6 years ago. But what he does with holding some of the voices and still keeping the articulation. I know tone is one of the main things we're talking about, but they all go hand in hand. But wow, to bring out the melody notes. I don't know if people have seen the score for this, but to connect the melody notes, the main melody notes, because the repeating thumb or the pinky in some cases, that's not brought out. what the moving line in the melody is, and keeping the left hand staccato. I don't think he used much pedal at all in
No,
that. And
it's that no,
well,
that performance is utterly mind
yeah,
blowing.
people
Yeah.
don't know how hard
And
it is
they
what he
don't
just
know
did.
how mind-blowing it is,
Yeah.
because it's not like Ravel's Alborada del Gracioso, like that wild, crazy
Right.
virtuoso piece that he recorded. But it requires so much technique to be able to do what he's doing there, because he plays the metrical precision, the absolute the articulation and the evenness of each
Consistency.
note has exactly the same touch.
Yeah.
And then he brings out this syncopation in the left hand that's just like, I think it's in the left hand. He syncopates the stuff that just comes out of nowhere, that you hear all of a sudden. You hear this extra syncopated thing while you hear that fluid phrasing in the main melody, and it's absolutely
It's stunning.
Yeah,
jaw-dropping.
it's because of what's going on in the mind too. What he just did is like you could hear a second Hungarian Rhapsody by Liszt, and it would be impressive, but not like this. Almost blows me away more because
Yeah.
of how difficult it is what he's doing, and it sounds so
Mhm.
simple.
Yeah.
And the tone is
Well,
so even. Everything's
Yeah.
controlled.
But it's always that beautiful tone, and that's the thing where there's never
There's not an edge.
There's not an edge. And just to use an example, like vocally, to give people an example. So, if I was talking and then all of a sudden, I like, this word comes out louder and breaks the phrase like that, like all of a sudden there's this accent, and it's no longer a smooth sentence like the one that I'm speaking now, where, there's this natural sense that fits with the shape of the words. He just keeps that so consistent, which is much harder to do in an instrument where you have different fingers. In the same way that, your words, you're putting all of these different words together in English, you do not separate the words like that so much when you're speaking naturally. And that's what's so hard for a musician, where you have these different keys and these different fingers that are working together. And to be able to have that fluidity and consistency of sound when there are so many different sounds that are capable. That you're capable of producing. It's absolutely stunning music making.
Mike, had you heard that? The
I
piece.
had not heard that.
Okay.
And I've heard that piece, but I've not heard that particular version. And wow, that was impressive. And it's like a fine clockmaker, where you just want to watch the gears turn. And it's so beautiful that you just want to see it turn and turn and do its thing. It really is amazing. And like you said, with the phraseology, like you never miss to say a beat, you never miss a phrase, you never miss where the line is going and what's kind of holding the whole line up. It's just magnificent.
Cathartic.
No, it's and that's one of the reasons why, he was such a genius. And just to point out that, even if listeners who are less able to articulate what they're hearing, or maybe aren't as trained, I do think when you hear that level, that quality, I think a lot of people will catch it. And I have a pretty interesting story about that. When I used to work at the A&A record store, back when there were record stores in Montreal, in the late 80s, when CDs first started coming out, and the Lipatti CDs arrived, the first publication on CD of that recording arrived while I was working there, and I put one on, and I put on his performance of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, which, is a beautiful piece of music that's very familiar. Every single person in the shop came up to see what was playing. And they sold out the 7 copies of the CD that we had before the 3.5-minute piece was finished.
Wow.
And this is when the CDs were $30 back then, which is about $90 now.
Yeah, that's amazing. And they just sold out because it was so
and
amazing.
Everybody could hear there's something going on.
There's something different.
Yeah.
There's something different. And that was, he apparently had that mystique. And Nadia Boulanger, who taught, pretty much all of the great musicians of the the middle of the 20th century, she said it was, he was completely unique in that way, that as soon as he walked on stage, everybody was held in his thrall. and there is that magnetism to his playing. And I think with all of these great artists, that is part of it, and that's that ownership in a sense that I was speaking to. Where Horowitz, he was there doing his thing as him, and that's what Cortot was doing, and that's what Lipatti was doing, and that's what Mayer was doing. But we can still listen to all of these different elements of their playing, the tone and the phrasing and the articulation, and the clarity with which they bring out this note more than that note, or so on. And those of us who are musically trained can have our little inner jumpy claps when we hear these incredible nuances, like, oh my God, how did Lipatti bring out those that syncopation and so on. But I think that the more people are exposed to this kind of fine playing, they do automatically start to weed out that which is not at the same standard. I do think it happens, and I've noticed that as well when I was doing regular, shortly after I started my Facebook page, I started having regular soirees in Vancouver, and people would come over and we'd listen, and they weren't that well trained, and but I started off with all of the greats, and they started listening and articulating. And I remember after a few sessions, I played a couple of artists who were more known but not as refined, and they absolutely articulated. Oh, well, he sounds a little bit more brusque, or oh, she sounds a bit emotionally detached, and they were really hearing those qualities. And I think it's just a matter of exposure to musicians. Once you hear musicians like this, you start to listen, I think, a bit differently.
I think you're right. I really think you're right. And that's why we're doing this episode, because I want some educated listeners out there.
And I think listeners they want to be able to pay attention, because it's hard, right? I mean, we're listening to music, it's really unfamiliar, and we're there, and we're sitting and focusing in a way that, our brains are not wired in the same way anymore, because, we used to, in the pre-internet age, be able to focus on things, I think, a bit differently. And it's great when we can start to listen. And even if we're not, there yet, or we're not able to articulate it, at the very least, the attempt and the interest and so on, I think this is something that's so important. And so I just think, again, just exactly what you're saying, Elias, before, for people not to be concerned if they hear it differently, or they don't like what we like, or what. That's all totally fine, right? I think it's just a matter of, at the very least, trying and listening and experimenting, and I think supporting the arts.
And go listen to, take another recording. There's so many available of this first partita, and listen to just the differences amongst them. And sometimes the greats do get weeded. I mean, they rise to the top. The cream rises to the top. Not always. There are many other things that make careers. Luck and just certain qualities. You mentioned Bolet. I never knew him. I knew people that knew him, but he was not always the easiest person. And I'm sure there are other things in his life that didn't give him the career that he wanted. And a lot of people that have potential, maybe they become bitter. We all become a little bit bitter when we don't get what we think we deserve. But then he did end up making it quite big. So there are different ways to come by fame, and they're not always. Right. It's not always great to be famous either. So
that's right, and also fame is not necessarily what everybody's path is, and it doesn't mean that they can't be doing whatever they're doing within their sphere of influence and being an absolutely stunning musician. And I think we've all come across that there are absolutely some world-class musicians who are not playing in world-class circumstances, and I don't think it necessarily diminishes what they're doing. They're doing what they're doing, and they're doing their artistry, and that's still important. And that's where I think it's, I still always want to support local musicians. I want to support whomever. I don't want to just go hear A-listers.
Right.
And I think that's important.
Yeah,
it's agreed.
Yeah, that's cool. Gosh, I wish we could just sit around and listen to all this stuff, but maybe can we listen to one or two more things? And,
I was wondering about Solomon. I've got one recording of Solomon's where I think he creates sounds that I've never heard anybody else do, that I think are kind of cool. And it's a really short little piece by de Séverac, which is Où l'on entend une vieille boîte à musique, or it's kind of listening to an old musical box,
Yeah.
and it really sounds like a musical box. And here there's the sound that he's producing, but I think there's also, if you want to listen to the pedaling, and the fact that as the way he's pedaling, you hear this aura, like there's this glow. So you sort of imagine almost if there's dim lighting, but then there's this glow coming from this lamp or this fire. But the glow is always there, but the notes never get all mushed together. So there's still the clarity while there's the glow. I just have no idea how he's doing this.
I'm
And
curious
it's
to hear
absolute
this.
magic. So.
I've usually just heard his Chopin and Beethoven, so this will be cool. Wow. He held the pedal at the end for a long time too through those chords, and it was still clear enough. I don't know if he was fluttering it a bit.
Oh, he must have been fluttering the whole time. I mean, it's just
Probably.
unbelievable because there's that consistency, there's that
It's
consistent
consistent.
haze,
Yeah.
but there's also the clarity, and it's absolutely mind blowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It almost seems like it's a commercial. I mean, it's just this old, RCA commercial, whatever, that on the old TV, and it's the orchestra that's
Mhm.
playing. I don't know. It really
Oh,
sounds like a music box, like a
I was actually going to use the word nostalgia. I mean, that
Yeah.
word, that is just it feels kind of far away, but close to your heart.
yeah.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, that's
That is
amazing
beautiful.
playing.
I've actually got a recording of Marilla Jonas playing a different kind of music, another music box piece.
Oh, sure.
And it's interesting because she doesn't pedal in quite the same way. It's a different composition, but you also hear, that beautiful crystalline tone. And again, it's also magic. And she does a different effect with the timing as well towards the end to really give a musical box effect. So what do you think? Shall we listen to that a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm up for it. what a brilliant piece. I don't know if all of that is written in the score with how she did the retard at the end. So
Isn't that
cool.
amazing? Just
That's
like the musical box
amazing.
unwinding. I mean, it's
It's
incredible.
brilliant.
So mine
But
was.
also,
Oh, go ahead.
no, well, I was just going to say that there's a similarity between those two pieces, but she still creates that gentle glass-like sound like Solomon did, but she's using the pedal, but not to create a haze. And so the performances are so different,
Yeah.
even though they have that same intent, and they're both so wonderful.
You really hear a lot of the melody, and I don't know if that D or G, I guess, kept kind of ringing out, but there's the right hand has so much bell-like quality to it. And it reminded me, my grandmother used to have this my Bubby had a phone holder, which I'm sure you've seen the music box where you set the old corded phones from the wall in there, and it
Right.
plays the music box. And I used to go over and always wind that up, and yeah, it gets slow at the end, so you can have to make it go fast. But that's, I mean, talk about nostalgia and just a great, what a great manner in which she played.
Another great thing to point out with that piece is her technique with her left hand, as far as like just such beautiful control. I mean, being able to make sure that never gets in the way of what the intent is, and yet still it has to be part of that music box. It's just brilliant.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, actually, I just thought we could listen to another like her playing something else, just to show that, again, the same artist can produce different sonorities. Because there's a recording I actually shared on my Facebook page today of her playing a Mendelssohn song without words. Maybe you can just listen to the first minute or so, and what you're going to hear, she has a much more robust, deep sound, and she voices, if you try to sing along, and this is something I suggest that listeners do a lot, once you get a grip of what the melody is, try singing along, and you'll then notice where they're timing and where the, getting louder or softer, or any of those kinds of particular nuance techniques that the pianist and any musician can bring, where they start doing that. Because you might just probably sing in more of a steady rhythm, and then you'll notice, oh, she went slower there or faster. Right. Or so on. She does some things here where her timing and the way when she has repeated notes, which one gets louder and which one's louder and softer, it is absolute mastery. So we'll listen to her play a little bit of this song without words. Isn't that extraordinary?
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And you're right. There's definitely, you can tell it's a different piece. It's a different, everything about that piece is different, and yet you really do feel her delicacy, even when it gets kind of broader and bigger. Like you can feel that she keeps like that tight, like a streamer on a wind current or something. It's just it's so nice.
Yeah.
And yet I find that one of the things she does, I think people think for something to be sensitive or, emotional, that it has to get softer. And that's something, like we hear in Chopin nocturnes, and especially in Chopin music in general, where, there's this kind of anemic quality that's crept into piano playing now where, if we're being sensitive, we can't be loud. And yet, there's moments where she gets quite loud when she's bringing out this climax, but it's still so sensitive and it's delicate still, even though there's more volume. And that's the thing that I think is, the absolute mastery of her playing, where the contours are still there. The phrasing is so fluid that when she builds up, it's never jarring because it's always done with such control and elegance, and she brings it right back down.
Yeah, it's like a paradox as always. A couple of students where I've gotten to teach, really high level students, and we get into almost these philosophical discussions of what does the music say? What do you want to do with it? And is that actually physically possible? And in a way, no, but that's part of the struggle. And that then becomes the way you make the music. And there are all these paradoxes that great artists, I feel that they sort of solve them in a way. And she seemed to solve some of those. So
that's
great.
Brilliant. Yeah, there's that tension. That's a great way to say it. Solving those problems.
Yeah. I mean, that recording was out of print for 70 years, 60 years,
Wow.
Probably. Her complete recordings are reissued together for the first time ever. I mean, they were never out as a set. They were released once on LP in the 1950s. That was it.
Wow.
And now you can get by, $25 on Amazon. Boom, there you go, 4 CDs, and you have this magic. I mean, we are living really at an incredible time.
Yeah.
When these things are available, and when you can go, these labels actually put the whole official playlist on YouTube, so you can actually just go and listen there. Although, of course, I suggest,
get the
this is something I would want to own. I mean, this is really, the set of her recordings is one of the greatest, most important, and most historical releases of the last 20 years, if not the last 50 years. The fact that these are out. She recorded about an hour or so worth of Chopin mazurkas that are just, every note is just so jaw-dropping of what she does in every phrase. It's mind-blowing. And how many other great artists are out there, from that era, as well as, nowadays we never know who's out there who's playing as well with such magic. So important to go here.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, gosh, we could go all night listening to so many.
We could. I know. Is there anyone, do you think?
Are we still talking about tone?
Yeah, I know, right? Well, I think we kind of mushed everything
I think
together.
You're right.
So much. That's why I'm glad I gave that quick introduction to all of them before, so as I think we can sort of get an idea. What do you think about some Friedman?
I was going to say it'd be nice to hear some, Friedman, Hoffman, but I love Friedman, just his mazurkas. I know we touched on last time you were here that he had danced mazurkas, and also I forgot the other pianist that you mentioned, another Polish pianist,
Jan Smetterlin,
okay, who had also danced maybe a different style. I know there are a few styles of mazurkas, and when I first heard Friedman, I was a master's student in Maryland, and at the time, actually, I had a professor. It was some class on interpretation, and then he became ill, unfortunately. Great guy. And then who took over was Donald Manildi from IPAN. So he was our teacher for that semester, and he brought in the Friedman recordings of the mazurkas, and I never heard them played like that. So
nobody has.
I lost sense of time.
Yeah, I mean, and you do lose sense of time quite literally, almost, because what he's doing, it's like, is that 3/4 really?
Yeah.
It sure doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
And it's Friedman is really a dimension unto himself. And he also recorded, he recorded famously that series of mazurkas, and he also recorded some Mendelssohn. songs without words that are very, similar as well. They were both Polish, actually, both Jonas and Friedman as well.
Okay.
But very different approaches as well to the mazurkas and so on. And that's the thing that's wonderful as well. I love them both, even though they play so differently.
Sure.
And I think that's what's really important.
That's the magic right there.
I think that is the magic, because it's like, oh, wow, I love the way he does that, and I love the way she does that.
Yeah.
And it's just, and I don't have to choose one. Like, we're so lucky, and that's the thing with art.
Yeah.
There is no number one, and this is one of the things I can't stand when I see, the top 10 list of whatever piano whatevers that these magazines and websites love to do, because it's always what about the 11th? Because that's right too, and the 20th, and so on and so forth. So well, do you think we should hear? There's so much with Friedman. There's that incredible nocturne that he recorded, which is one of the greatest ever. There's mazurkas, there's Mendelssohn.
I would go for a mazurka, and I grew up with Rubin. I still love Rubinstein's mazurkas, and I actually love Moravec a lot too, and Ashkenazi. I grew up with that kind of more standard, but they're all great. But his mazurkas are, if anybody hasn't heard him play mazurkas, maybe first go listen to somebody like an Ashkenazi who's phenomenal. I love Ashkenazi. And Rubinstein is colorful and beautiful and everything, or Horowitz. But then you listen to Friedman, it's like, it's just so different.
Well, it's different. Because he, in a sense, it might sound like, that he makes a mountain out of a molehill, because these are no longer little quaint little village pieces. It's like all of a sudden it becomes this gigantic epic story. But rhythmically, he's actually doing something that, there's documented evidence that this is what Chopin wanted, because Chopin got into an argument with a fellow composer who said, but that's not the rhythm that you're saying it is. And this was, not just any musician, this was another composer, Meyerbeer, who, and they never spoke again, apparently, because they had this argument where Chopin was showing that, no, I want this accented in this certain way, that he couldn't communicate through the written notation.
Yeah.
And this is probably what it is that we're hearing Friedman do. And again, it doesn't mean that everybody needs to do it. Mariela Jonas does not do that in her mazurka recordings, and I would not trade her mazurka recordings for anything, but nor would I trade Friedman's.
Yeah.
So
maybe a little bit of that.
That goes back to that authenticity. Like what is it what are you capable of even owning? And you're playing one thing is completely different than somebody who's lived it, or it's just different. It's not worse or better, it's different.
That's it. That's it. Okay, so let me pull up a mazurka here, and let's give this a listen.
Cool. so cool.
I mean, you could really wonder whether somebody slipped something into your drink, because if you're listening to this,
Right.
what parallel dimension did I just enter? Because this is just not, we ain't in Kansas anymore.
Yeah.
That rhythm is wild.
It's really, and it can ruffle some feathers, because it's not sort of this dainty, quaint, cute little, way I'm expecting to hear it. And, I suspect if we heard Beethoven himself play, some feathers would be ruffled.
Yeah.
And possibly if we heard Chopin himself play. And this is something that I've had to say to students, when they were saying, I might have brought this up before in our previous talk, when I played Rachmaninoff playing Chopin to them, and they said, "Oh, his rubato is so exaggerated." And I'm thinking, well, and yours isn't, and I said, well, but what, I held myself back, and I said, so is there any guarantee that if you heard a recording by Chopin that you would like it?
Yeah, yeah.
And their jaws just dropped, and they realized, oh, okay,
Maybe
we've got some biases.
Yeah.
And it might not be, and it doesn't mean that we can't like this other way. It doesn't mean we can't like the not rhythmically, sort of doing what Friedman's doing, and those soaring phrases that just, these dramatic bursts of energy. Of course, there's other ways, but it's still so wonderful.
It's like when you brought up the story of Bartok teaching his student and his own pieces and saying, don't play that so much in the style of Bartok. It has to be more, whatever you're thinking Bartok is, it's not me.
It's not, that's not it. Yeah, exactly.
I love what,
and that,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, I actually, you're going to have to edit this part out, because I can't remember what I was going to say.
Well, then go ahead. I was going to say with Friedman, what he does with some of the phrases, like he gets this really robust bass, and there's just so much buoyancy to it. Very, very dance-like, but sort of a frenetic dance energy, and you're just all over the place. And then I love how he breaks expectation, and that's why I had one little chuckle. And I think I heard Mike chuckle a bit in another piece we were listening to, and I also remember, obviously people are not going to hear that because we're going to play the recording, but you just have a certain expectation that it will go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and sometimes he goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or he goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Like he got the one in before you were ready for it.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's like how'd you get the one in there? I wasn't there yet, but somehow you snuck it in. So.
I know, it's absolutely amazing, and that's and there's stuff there because you guys are so much more adept with the manual side of the performance style, whereas for me it's really my ears that are well trained, but I'm not as into the score where you're naming. It sounds like you've got perfect pitch, and you could name you could name what note Marilyn was playing there. So that's beyond me as well. And so there's going to be some of this stuff where we're not going to catch it, but we still get the impression, or we still get the emotional response, and that's fabulous. And that's kind of what we want. I think we want to stir the pot a little bit and hear some, have the music create some kind of impression. And that's what these musicians were so great at doing.
Yeah. And yet he'd probably be eliminated in the first round of I know it's cliche to say, but he'd be eliminated.
Oh, no, well, and it's absolutely true. And again, you'll forgive me if I can't remember if I mentioned this last time, but one of the first talks I gave at a university was it was arranged by Alan Walker, the Liszt and Chopin biographer, in Ontario, and it was an introduction to historical recordings, and I had 10 pianists, and he said afterwards, well, I think 8 or 9 of them wouldn't have made it through the first round of the competition today.
It's so, what? Okay, well,
and it's true.
With him, he was actually my judge, one of my judges at the International LA Liszt competition. He was on the panel. And it's funny because, a lot of the people that, and I'm not saying him or others, but a lot of people that kind of call for that, or the big name teachers who leave the juries because they're pissed off and this great artist wasn't chosen. But often, not always, but often those are the same teachers or people who have kind of promoted that or pushed that or taught that or chosen, 10 other winners in competitions that exhibited those things that they seem to be against. And I don't know. I've judged now a number of competitions myself, and it's really hard. So I understand.
Yeah, it is really hard to be there in the moment, and you have very little time to make your your notes. And then, there's this democratic process where it has to, everything needs to be tabulated. And so, but enough people can believe really strongly in one and it doesn't work in the other. Lipatti came in second.
Yeah.
He tied for second, in fact, in Vienna. And that's probably one of the things that actually launched his career, as it did happen for many, because Cortot refused to sign his certificate and said, come study with me in Paris, which Lipatti did starting the next year. And Cortot was then famously said more than once, well, I actually don't have anything to teach you, because he was and I met somebody who was at one of the master classes, and he said, Lipatti played something. He was about 16 or 17. And Lipatti played something, and Cortot just sat there and he said nothing.
Oh, wow.
And then he just said, I have nothing to say. That was perfect. That was it. But it's hard. Competitions are hard. Yeah. And apparently the person who won that competition actually was amazing, and sadly, went insane and died in an asylum not long after. So it's really quite tragic. So these things happen, but competitions are not everything, and this is what's challenging. And how do we, how do you compare Friedman with Jonas, with Lipatti, with Solomon? Like, they're completely different artists doing completely different things, all of which is wonderful.
Yeah, we can enjoy all of them.
This is what's so difficult. And so I have very wide-ranging tastes in what I like to listen to and who I enjoy hearing. And, other people will as well, or they're going to have whatever parameters they like, and that's great, but I think that at the very least, to know that things are possible that we didn't necessarily know are possible. Yeah. And that's one of the things we happen when we hear Friedman and Hoffman and Lipatti for the first time. We hear these effects and we think, my gosh, what did I just hear?
Mm-hmm. I think art is so important to understand that there are so many levels of greatness and different levels of greatness. And we're in a society, at least in the Western world, where places and prizes and objectively measurable things are so important. And people don't even realize how subjective that is. So we say, like, oh, the fastest runner, or the fastest man, or the fastest woman, or the best tennis player, and we don't realize that the game of tennis has changed so much in the last 30 years. You can't compare number one today with Connors or something. They were playing essentially different games. So how can you say, and people always like to say, well, like in one of my circles, the chess circle, would Bobby Fischer beat Magnus Carlsen today? That's a hypothetical. And in some ways, the answer is easy. Of course not. But in other ways, if Bobby Fischer had the same opportunities and access to computer databases as we do today in the internet, and all the opening theory that's been developed over 50 years, I mean, he had a genius and a gift. So maybe he'd have the things that the stars would align for him. But those hypotheticals don't really work.
Totally. Well, it's like Nadia Comaneci. You look at what won a 10, the first perfect 10 in gymnastics. There was no doubles. And now people are doing triples with twists. So everything. The most anybody did was like a tumbling run that had like maybe three parts to it. Now they're doing these things that have like 7 or 8, and then there's a triple somersault with a twist. It was just absolutely inconceivable back then.
It's pushed.
And she also had a charm, though, where her movements were not contrived, where if you look at the fluidity of her movements, she wasn't saying, okay, well, I have to do this with my wrists, or I have to do, like, it was all part of a natural expression, whereas now you see them doing things by component and requirement. In terms of, I have to pause after my sticks. All of a sudden we're talking about gymnastics now. But if anybody gets it, they'll get it. The standards have changed in some ways. Yes, it's wonderful because there's advances and there's things that have gotten better, but I get concerned when the technical level has gotten better without that artistic lived in, like we've got, nice modern homes, but then, well, how's the design inside and what's happening in the design? And are people really living? Are they enjoying their interiors? Or is it really expressing who they are? Which is this whole other story. So I think that,
part of the philosophical discussion is, do you relinquish some of the artistry when you increase that technical difficulty? Have we lost some of it? And do we need to? I mean, can we still have those triple flips today and all the tough stuff and have the artistry still? I think so.
But
I would think so. Well, listen, I mean, Lipatti's Bach was made possible with a technique that helped him play that Ravel Alborada del Gracioso with these glissandi that nobody's ever been able to equal since, despite all the incredible technique that apparently everybody has today.
Mhm.
Nobody can still do those glissandi that he did unedited, because the recordings were not edited back then. And so, but it was, how was he using his technique? So he used his technique in Bach to play the Bach the way that it should be played, and not by overdoing it. So, the same technique that can do a triple somersault can also do a single or a double.
Yeah.
Right? And it can do it probably really well. And this is the fact that, I think with any kind of skill, you need to have more than you need to be able to do something well. And so if all these people now and this is absolutely true, that at the time, in the 1950s, very few people could play Stravinsky's Petrushka Suite.
Sure. Yeah.
And certainly when it was written in the 1920s, very few people could. Marcel Mayer recorded it, and I was told by the engineer that was the only time she had to do several retakes. That it was difficult. And she had a phenomenal technique.
Yeah.
But that was the only time that they ever had to do, several takes. And nowadays, everybody can do that.
Yeah.
But how? And with what kind of tone, where they do play the Stravinsky Bartokish and Stravinsky-ish instead of necessarily, with that jazzy kind of looser, and how's the voicing and so on. So, there's something for something. And I think with all the technique, and to rephrase that rather than technique, with all of
finger
the
dexterity.
incredible, exactly, the dexterity and the digital precision that people have nowadays, and the capacity to play that kind of complex music, if they can then use that control that they've got to phrase things melodically, to do that kind of transparent voicing like Lipatti was doing in the Bach, and that regularity of rhythm, that would be something. I interviewed Livia Rev, a great Hungarian pianist, for her 95th birthday about a decade ago. And she actually brought up the same thing. She said, well, everybody can play Prokofiev and Stravinsky now. And she's like, I ask all my students to bring me a movement of an early Beethoven, of a middle period Beethoven sonata and a Mozart and so on. And she's like, invariably the students will say, oh, you like easy music? To which she would say, we'll see if it's easy by the time I'm done with you.
Right. Well, by the way, and I think what you just hit on is key. Like for music to continue to evolve, and for the art of music to continue to become what it can be, and turn those magnificent triple somersaults into something artistic, and that's communicating something genuine. It really takes, first of all, an artist who's capable of doing it, and then second of all, a mentor or somebody who can push that artist in a way that can allow the expression and the communication, because art in all its forms, specifically music, is really about communicating something that cannot be communicated in any other way. And it really takes both sides of that, an artist and somebody who can mentor that artist in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is what's really important. If we think that when these musicians were being trained, that we're listening to in these historical recordings, they were learning, first of all, a level of dexterity and technique that was actually in some ways beyond what's being taught now, because they were really being taught on a very deep level, some of the mechanics, but also some of the interpretative elements. But they were also living a cultured life that was very different.
Yeah.
Right.
And where it was not, this many credits in university and you have to do this and you have to spend time doing that, which, some of which can enhance some things, but which can also squeeze some of the joy and some of the passion, and also not inform your music making by, you go to a museum and you see the paintings, that's going to inform something else, where it was, this language of the time. And these were all different faces of the creative essence and spirit and mindset. So I think that unfortunately, things have gotten quite technical and dry as well in terms of the lived experience of art and artistry. So
absolutely.
I hope that changes a bit. I see some glimmers of hope.
I do as well, and I do see as well. You named that things are starting to change in piano circles in terms of individuality. I am absolutely seeing a change and hearing a change in hearing levels of individuality. And Andrew Tyson, whom I met and heard in Vancouver a few years ago, he delivered. I still remember this one nuance in Chopin's Fourth Ballade that was just so phenomenal. And then it was not surprised afterwards in the Q&A when he said that his life changed when he was 14 and his teacher gave him a CD of Cortot. And I was like, well, that would explain it, right? Yeah. And then we met afterwards, and he's like, oh, I've actually been following your page for years. And I was like, oh, well, there we go. And we've talked about this, and he, this how much do you follow the text, and how much do you, bring things out? And I'm grateful that there's somebody like him, and he's just one of many who are starting to really, they're really searching and listening on all of these levels and choosing to be very individual. And I think that where individuality is not contradictory to service of the music, but in fact is a required component.
That's important, because I think in today's world we have a lot of I'm just, and it's good, empowerment for the self is important, and we've come a long way in psychology since the 1950s. But just whatever I say is important just because I said it and it's me. And it's like, well, what has given you that authority, or have you earned that authority? And maybe you can't earn it. I don't know, but there's something to like having to defend that a bit, or having it also be classy and having it work in a culture. Although sometimes you just want to be outside that completely. And there are a few successful people that, break all the molds, and then they're okay. And it's really them. But I think we get into this very, at least in the Western world, in the US especially, this very individualistic, I am the most important. And so whatever I say is great just because I said it. And it's like, well, let's also follow the footsteps of other greats, and learn from others. So.
And the humility as well, right? I mean, there's that really important balance between confidence and humility that I think is a real dance for the artistic mindset, and to really be able to both stand behind what you do, but also be exploring and, not necessarily sure. And I'm going to try this because I'm curious if this is going to work, and that's part of the creative process as well, where you're not overriding with personality, but you're actually engaged in a dance, and inspiration, meets you on the dance floor, meets you at the piano, and it's this collaborative process.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Oh yeah, I love that.
We'll quote you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That might go somewhere up front, I think.
Yeah.
No, that's beautifully said, Mark. And I think it also takes people like yourself, people who are willing to go through the effort. And I acknowledge it takes effort to understand and listen to and prepare your ears and your mind so that you can communicate to us and to artists of the future. Like it takes people like you to be able to recognize greatness when it's presented. And I appreciate that about you bringing that to us tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I loved hearing everything you guys have so much experience yourselves, and, and from that different angle of being at the keyboard and being able to hear your thoughts and your impressions. It's so important for us to be able to have these conversations, and also to hear, and this is something that we're not seeing in the world as well right now, this, being able to also have, we've agreed largely, although perhaps not entirely. And this is like to be able to have a conversation with people who have different perspectives, and nobody's wrong. We're just listening and we're sharing our ideas and having this alive conversation and exploring these topics. I think it's so important. I think that's one of the great things that the arts can bring us.
Yep.
I agree 100%. Is there a piece that maybe you could leave us on that maybe you can say, hey, if there's something you want to listen to?
This is a great question. Elias, something come to mind for
boy.
you?
I'm just thinking of what you listed here.
I was going to say, we haven't heard any Hoffman yet.
Hoffman's
I
great.
haven't heard.
I mean, the C sharp is very, very famous. But
I don't think I would leave with that.
no.
I wonder what even. Actually, I think this will be a little unexpected. I think it's going to be a bit of a Geza and a part of the Schumann Etude Symphonique.
Okay.
And this will be. I think you'll hear there's a bit of magic over here.
Voila, indeed. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for sharing your expertise. By the way, we've been listening to Mark Ainley. I haven't mentioned your name since the beginning. You can find him on the Piano Files Facebook page. Where else can people find you if they want to hear more about what you do?
Thepianofiles.com. I also have the Piano Files pages on Patreon, on Twitter, on Instagram. That to hear the recordings, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon are the ways to go.
Fantastic.
And the website has longer features as well. So
okay, wonderful. And we also have my co-host, Elias Axel Pedersen.
I love doing this music stuff. It's great.
It's been amazing. My name is Mike Levitt, and you've been listening to And If Love Remains.